My husband died after years in a coma and left me everything. But my kids, who never visited him, tried to humiliate me and steal our house. I never imagined the shame they'd face when the judge asked. Not a single visit? My secret was about to silence the whole family. Before we continue, hit like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments what city or state you're watching from. It started the moment I allowed myself to breathe. That's the truth I have to tell you. The ugly, secret part of my grief. My husband, Richard, passed away at 5:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and while the pain of his absence was a hollow, aching thing in my chest, there was an equally powerful wave of relief. He had been in a coma, stable but unresponsive, for nearly 5 years. 5 years where I, Eleanor, now 58 years old, lived a life tethered to a hospital bed, where my existence revolved solely around the beeping of monitors and the cold comfort of linoleum floors. I deserved that moment of peace. I earned it. I had just managed to arrange the burial, a modest affair mostly attended by his work colleagues and a handful of old friends. William and Jessica, my son and daughter, showed up, of course. They were both well into their 30s. William a slick financial advisor in Toronto, Jessica a self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer, living a perpetually sun-drenched existence in Miami. Their presence felt less like an expression of mourning and more like a necessary public relations stunt. They air-kissed me. They cried on cue for the cameras. I'm sure Jessica was live-streaming some filtered version of the tragedy, and they were gone before the dirt settled on the grave. I hadn't seen them much in the 5 years Richard was vegetative, and I certainly didn't expect them to linger now that he was truly gone. I thought, foolishly, that the hardest part was over. I had faced the death, the quiet closing of a chapter that had exhausted my body and soul. I was finally ready to sit in my quiet, spacious home, the home Richard and I had built together in upstate New York, and simply be still. I poured myself a glass of Chardonnay that Friday afternoon, sat in Richard's armchair, and felt a tiny flicker of hope for the future. The hope lasted exactly until the mail arrived. It wasn't a condolence card or a note of comfort. It was a crisp, heavy envelope with the imposing letterhead of Grant & Associates, a high-powered law firm that charged more for a consultation than I'd spent on groceries in a month. I stared at the envelope, the sharp corners seemingly digging into the polished wood of my antique table. Something in the quality of the paper and the sterile formality of the address, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, made my stomach clench. When I finally tore it open, the legalese hit me like a physical blow. The letter stated, in cold, clinical terms, that the beneficiaries of the late Richard Vance, namely his children, William Vance and Jessica Vance, were formally contesting the validity of the last will and testament dated 7 years prior. The core argument: undue influence, claiming I had exerted pressure on Richard while his mental capacity was supposedly compromised, and demanding an immediate freeze on all assets, particularly the family house, citing it as part of the contested estate. Undue influence? I whispered, the absurdity of the claim making my voice shake. Richard had been in a coma for the last 5 years. The will was drafted 2 years before he suffered the aneurysm, when he was sharp, meticulous, and completely himself. But the details didn't matter to the lawyers. The threat did. The cold, hard reality was that my children were not mourning their father. They were mobilizing to steal his legacy from the woman who had sacrificed half a decade to keep him comfortable. They were treating me, their mother, like a gold-digging stranger, an interloper who needed to be evicted. The wine tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at the framed photo of Richard on the mantel, his kind eyes smiling back at me, and I felt a betrayal so profound it eclipsed the grief. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was a declaration of war. A war started by the very people Richard and I had worked tirelessly to raise and protect. The shame wasn't theirs yet. The shame was mine. The shame of realizing that my own children saw me as an obstacle to their inheritance, not as their mother. I had a long, agonizing weekend ahead of me, just staring at that letter. By Monday, I knew I had to find a lawyer myself. But before I did that, I needed to revisit the darkest corners of the last 5 years and truly understand the level of their abandonment, because that, I suspected, was the real weapon in my arsenal. I just didn't know yet how deadly that weapon would be. When that initial letter arrived, the lawyers used words like manipulation and asset protection. But what they conveniently forgot to mention was the reality of my life during those 5 years. The reality was Richard and I alone. The reality was me, sleeping on a cot next to his bed in the long-term care wing, counting the days, the hours, the minutes. The silence in that room was deafening, only broken by the machine that breathed for him. And in that silence, I had hundreds, maybe thousands, of conversations with the man I loved. I'd pull a chair close, hold his hand, which always felt surprisingly warm, almost normal, and I'd talk. I'd tell him about the garden, the ridiculous price of gasoline, the old couple down the street who finally sold their house. I told him about the children, too. And this is where the shame truly rests, not on me, but on them. I never sugarcoated it for Richard. I didn't have to. He wasn't listening, not in the way we usually define it. But I felt compelled to tell him the truth, maybe as a form of self-therapy, maybe as a witness to the profound neglect. Richard, I'd murmur, stroking his forehead. Jessica posted a photo today from the Maldives. Another tropical beach. She didn't mention you. I called her, told her you had a slight fever. She said she'd send a prayer emoji. A prayer emoji. That was the extent of her concern for the father who paid her college tuition and still technically owned the house she flaunted during her brief, infrequent visits home. William was worse. William, the financier, the businessman, saw his father's state as an inconvenience, a black mark on his success narrative. His visits were always brief, rushed, and agonizingly focused on business. He'd stand awkwardly by the door, glance at the monitor, and then pull me into the hallway to ask, "Mom, have you checked the stock portfolio? Should we liquidate any bonds?" Dad wouldn't want the market to eat into his capital. Capital. Never dad or father, only capital. He saw the man in the bed as an asset, a holding that had simply paused its yield. He'd never spend more than 20 minutes in the room. It wasn't just that they didn't visit. They chose not to. I would call them, at first, full of hope, then with dwindling expectation, and finally, out of sheer duty, on holidays, on Richard's birthdays, on anniversaries. "It's too hard, Mom." Jessica would sigh dramatically over the phone, the sound of club music faintly in the background. "I can't see him like that. It's too traumatic for me. I'm busy with a huge acquisition," William would state flatly, as if closing a deal was more important than the man who taught him how to tie his first tie. I never told Richard any of those excuses. To Richard, I simply said, "William is so busy at work, dear. He sends his love," or "Jessica's flight was delayed, but she'll call later." I protected him even in his vegetative state, shielding his memory from the cruel, cold reality of his children's hearts. It was the only thing I could still do for him. And yet, here they were, after 5 years of indifference, suddenly galvanized by the scent of money. The irony was so thick it tasted like bile. They hadn't wanted the man. They only wanted his things. That reflection, those years of silent counting and lonely conversations, was what hardened my resolve after reading the lawyer's letter. They wanted to attack my character? They wanted to claim undue influence? Fine. I would show them what true influence looked like. The influence of 5 years of unconditional love against 5 years of utter neglect. They had no idea the truth I was willing to bring into the light. They had no idea how many painful details I had filed away. But I still needed a lawyer, and I needed one who wasn't afraid to fight the arrogance of a multi-million-dollar law firm. The confrontation happened exactly 2 weeks after the letter arrived. I had been instructed by my newly hired attorney, a woman named Sarah, to meet William and Jessica, along with their high-powered legal team, for a mandatory initial meeting to discuss the terms of the contested estate. Sarah wasn't part of a massive firm like the one representing my children. She ran a small practice focused mostly on wills and trusts, but she had a fire in her eyes and an immediate understanding of the emotional injustice of my case. "They're counting on you settling out of fear, Eleanor," Sarah told me, leaning across the worn oak table in her small office. "They think your grief and exhaustion will make you take their insulting offer just to make them go away." And so, on a crisp autumn morning, I walked into the glass and steel offices of Grant & Associates. The room they assigned for the meeting was all chrome and intimidating city views. When William and Jessica walked in, my heart didn't break. It turned to stone. They looked like they were auditioning for a high-gloss reality show. William, with his suit tailored to impossible perfection and a watch that likely cost more than my car. Jessica, draped in a designer dress that looked utterly inappropriate for a legal setting, her face expertly contoured, radiating an aggressive confidence. There was no sadness in their eyes, only entitlement. "Hi, Mom," Jessica said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. It was the kind of voice she used when she wanted something, usually money. She didn't attempt a hug. William didn't even bother with the pleasantries. He nodded curtly at me and immediately addressed his lawyer, a severe man named Mr. Sterling, as if I were simply part of the furniture. "Mr. Sterling, let's keep this brief. We're offering a clean split of the current liquid assets, and we'll allow her to remain in the house for 6 months, provided she agrees to the sale and a fair market appraisal immediately. It's generous, given the circumstances." I listened to the word generous hang in the air and felt a surge of cold fury. This house, the one they were willing to allow me to stay in for 6 months, was where I had raised them, where Richard and I had fallen in love, where I had spent the last 5 years praying for a miracle that never came. Sarah, bless her heart, spoke up. "That offer is insulting, Mr. Vance. The will clearly states Eleanor Vance is the sole beneficiary. Your claim of undue influence is baseless and cruel, considering your father's medical status for the last 5 years. William didn't flinch. "My mother has been under immense strain. It's possible she's forgotten details. We believe the 7-year-old will was signed when Dad was already beginning to show signs of cognitive decline. We're simply protecting our father's true intentions." I couldn't stand it anymore. My confession needed to start right there. I cut him off, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Richard signed that will 2 years before his aneurysm, William. He was healthy, lucid, and furious about your spending habits. He told me then, he was worried you'd squander everything." Jessica bristled. "Mom, don't be dramatic. This is business." "Business?" I challenged, meeting her gaze for the first time. I was in the hospital room, watching him waste away, making that my business. "Where were you, Jessica?" "Oh, wait, I know. You were posting photos of your new yacht rental. Don't talk to me about business." The tension in the room spiked. Mr. Sterling intervened immediately, shutting down the personal attack. But the point had been made. I saw a flicker of something in William's eyes, not guilt, but annoyance at having his facade chipped. They underestimated my strength. They mistook my exhaustion for weakness. We left without an agreement, Sarah promising to file a robust defense. I knew their game plan now, use their wealth and my children's name recognition to paint me as the villain. But as I walked out of that opulent office, a quiet thought settled in my mind, a fragment of memory that felt crucially important. Richard. He had given me something, a small envelope years ago, right before everything went wrong. If their goal was to expose my life, mine was now to expose their hypocrisy. And I had a feeling Richard had given me the tool to do it. That evening, after the acidic taste of the confrontation had faded, the memory of the envelope became an obsession. It was an insignificant event from a lifetime ago, one of those quiet, almost mundane moments that get buried under the weight of major tragedy. I remember it was a cold December day, about 6 months before Richard's aneurysm. We were sitting by the fireplace, the house quiet, the children long gone from home. Richard had been unusually reflective. He wasn't sick then, but he'd just come back from a checkup where the doctor had mentioned elevated blood pressure. He was a man who planned everything, from his retirement portfolio down to the alignment of his socks. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a familiar, deep love and a strange, almost nervous tension. "Ellie," he said, using his old nickname for me, "I need to give you this. It's not the official will, that's with our lawyer, of course. This is a supplement. A kind of failsafe." He handed me a heavy cream-colored envelope, sealed with a glob of red sealing wax, a dramatic, old-fashioned touch that was so typical of him. "If anything happens to me, before you decide to sell the house or make any big moves, you open this. You follow my instructions. Promise me." I laughed then, dismissing it as Richard being overly dramatic. I'd promised, tucked the envelope into a small, antique wooden box on my vanity, and forgotten about it completely as the nightmare of the coma descended. Now, years later, The weight of that promise felt enormous. I raced upstairs to my bedroom, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The antique box was still there, a simple cedar jewelry case. I fumbled with the clasp, lifted the lid, and began frantically moving aside old necklaces, brooches, and faded photographs. My hands were shaking so badly I was practically throwing things onto the floor. It wasn't there. A cold panic seized me, a dread worse than any legal threat. Had I moved it? Had Richard taken it back? Could a simple, handwritten note override the legal might of a contested will? Logically, no. But this felt different. This felt like Richard's final voice, his moral judgment, and if I had any chance of winning, I needed his words, his silent witness too. Speak for me. I searched the vanity, the drawers, the closet. I even crawled under the bed, dusting off ancient dust bunnies and forgotten shoes. Nothing. I sat back on the floor, defeated, tears blurring my vision. All that hope shattered. Then, my eyes landed on a large, heavy book on the nightstand, a beautiful leather-bound copy of Moby Dick that Richard had cherished but never finished. I remembered him saying once, "If I ever want to hide a treasure, Eleanor, I'll put it in the most obvious place." With trembling fingers, I picked up the book. It felt slightly heavier than it should. I opened the front cover, and there it was, slipped neatly inside the front flap, taped securely so it wouldn't fall out, the cream-colored envelope, the red wax seal intact. I didn't open it. Not yet. I knew Sarah would need to handle this carefully. It might be nothing but a sentimental love note. Or it might be the truth, the kind of truth that could be wielded in a courtroom. I held the heavy paper against my chest, feeling the imprint of Richard's seal, and for the first time since the lawsuit started, I felt a genuine connection to my husband, a feeling that he was fighting alongside me. I had found his voice. Now, I just had to figure out how to make a judge listen to a man who hadn't spoken in 5 years. Sarah, my lawyer, examined the envelope with the meticulous caution of a forensic scientist. She didn't want to break the seal unless we absolutely had to. "It's a fantastic piece of emotional evidence, Eleanor," she admitted, turning the envelope over in her hand. The sealing wax, the date 6 months before his coma. It shows intent. It shows that Richard was anticipating potential issues and wanted to protect you and his wishes. Their side, meanwhile, continued their attack, now focused less on undue influence and more on painting Richard as an unstable, erratic man in the years leading up to his incapacitation. Mr. Sterling, the arrogant lawyer for William and Jessica, filed motions that were less about legality and more about character assassination, digging up old medical records and trying to find instances where Richard had been stressed or moody. Then came the generous offer. It was conveyed via email, short, sharp, and laced with condescension. They proposed that I sign over the house entirely. In return, they would graciously give me a lump sum payment equivalent to 20% of the home's appraised value, a value they insisted on setting, of course. The attached note, drafted by William, stated that this was the final attempt at reconciliation, and that further litigation would only serve to embarrass the family. Embarrass the family. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They had filed a public lawsuit against their own mother to seize the home she had maintained for 30 years, but I would be the one causing embarrassment by fighting back. I printed the email and took it to Sarah. She read it and simply shook her head. "They're trying to leverage your emotional fatigue, Eleanor. They know the emotional cost of a trial is often higher than the financial cost of settling. What do you want to do?" I thought about the 5 years of silent rooms, the 5 years I had been a nurse, a bookkeeper, a maid, a sole advocate, all while they were enjoying their lavish lives. I thought about the sheer nerve of William and Jessica, viewing me as nothing more than a temporary tenant. "No," I told Sarah, my voice firm and clear. "Absolutely not. They want to avoid embarrassment? Too late. They started this. I want the judge to see every single detail of their abandonment. I want to call them to the stand and ask them when they last changed their father's pillowcase. I want to ask them the name of the nurse who spent 5 nights a week by his side. They think I'm weak. I want to show them the strength of a woman who survived 5 years of hell alone." Sarah smiled, a genuine, appreciative smile that reached her eyes. "Good. Then we will proceed with the trial. We'll use the envelope as an exhibit, requesting the judge to review it in camera, privately, before any final ruling on the will itself. We need to frame this not as a contest over property, but as a contest over Richard's memory. With the court date set, the waiting began. But the anxiety was replaced by a strange, quiet focus. I spent the next few weeks gathering evidence, my daily hospital sign-in sheets, the logs of all the phone calls I'd made to William and Jessica that went unreturned, and the thousands of dollars I'd spent personally on Richard's care that were never reimbursed by the children who were supposed to be protecting his capital. I was meticulously preparing my defense, turning their legal harassment into a moral indictment. The day of the hearing was set for the following month. The clock was ticking, and I knew the next confrontation wouldn't be in a sterile boardroom. It would be under the unforgiving gaze of justice. The closer the court date got, the less the house and the money mattered. It became purely about the truth about Richard and what those 5 years of absence meant. I started thinking less about legal arguments and more about the existential price of their neglect. Richard, even in a coma, was an intensely proud man. He provided. He protected. He was fiercely loyal. And he loved his children, fiercely, unconditionally. But I had to wonder, sitting alone in the quiet house, staring at the empty side of the bed, if some part of his spirit, the part that remained tethered to his unresponsive body, had sensed their betrayal. I remembered the gentle, constant pressure in the hospital room. I'd always assumed the pressure was the sadness, the weight of his illness. But what if it was disappointment? What if he was silently registering the lack of a familiar touch, the absence of his children's voices on Christmas morning? It was a cold, devastating thought. William and Jessica hadn't just neglected me. They had failed the only test Richard, in his silence, had given them, the test of basic filial love. They prioritized their Instagram feeds and their stock options over the simple duty of sitting by the man who gave them everything. They believed their expensive suits and designer bags were proof of their success, but they were actually evidence of a profound spiritual bankruptcy. My lawyer, Sarah, warned me to keep my emotions separate from the facts. We have to focus on the intent of the will, Eleanor. We can't turn this into a judgment on their parenting or lack thereof. But I knew that was exactly what I had to do. The will was clear, yes, but the contest was predicated on a moral lie, that they were the rightful, concerned heirs being shut out by a greedy widow. If I could shatter that lie, if I could show the judge the cold calculation behind their actions, the legal battle would crumble. The truth, in this case, was the sharpest piece of evidence. I spent a day meticulously documenting their absence. I pulled up Jessica's social media from the past 5 years, photos of skiing trips in Aspen, yachting in the Mediterranean, always perfectly curated, always far away. I gathered the few email exchanges with William, where every inquiry about his father was followed by an immediate question about the estate's valuation. I even pulled my phone records, marking the countless unreturned calls. The file looked less like a legal brief and more like an archaeological dig into the ruins of a family. As I worked, I came across a photograph from about 6 months before Richard's coma, taken at a family dinner. Richard looked healthy, smiling, with William on his left and Jessica on his right. But Richard wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at me, a worried, almost imploring look in his eyes. He knew something was changing. He knew his children were prioritizing their materialistic lives over the connection with their parents. That look was the key to the sealed envelope. It solidified my decision. I wasn't fighting for the house anymore. I was fighting for the memory of the man who died alone, guarded only by my love. I was fighting to prevent his betrayers from profiting off their cruelty. I wanted them to feel a fraction of the isolation I had felt in that hospital room. I just had to trust that Judge Harrison would look beyond the paper and see the moral rot that had infected my family. The morning of the hearing, the air felt thin and sharp. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple dark navy dress. Nothing flashy, nothing that would suggest the kind of ostentation my children were about to display. I needed to look like what I was, a woman who had spent 5 years by a hospital bed, now forced to defend her quiet dignity. Sarah, my lawyer, met me downstairs, her face a mask of calm determination. Remember, Eleanor. We are prepared. We are acting in accordance with Richard's documented wishes. They are acting on greed. In my small handbag, Tucked carefully next to my lip balm was the cream-colored envelope, its red seal still intact. It was the heaviest thing I carried. The courthouse was a grand, impersonal building, all marble floors and echoing hallways. When we were directed to the courtroom, Sarah and I took seats at the defense table. Then they arrived. William and Jessica entered the courtroom flanked by Mr. Sterling and two other sharp-suited associates. They looked less like grieving children and more like a hostile corporate takeover team. William wore a custom-tailored gray suit that shimmered slightly in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Jessica was in an impeccably white power suit, her expression cool, confident, and utterly devoid of emotion. They nodded briefly to their legal team, ignored me entirely, and settled into their seats with an air of absolute certainty. They were there for a quick, inevitable victory. I watched them, and a strange calm washed over me. Their arrogance was their shield, but it was also their most glaring weakness. It betrayed their lack of respect for the process, for the judge, and for the father whose memory they were trampling. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harrison entered. He was a man in his early 60s, with a reputation for meticulousness and an almost palpable weariness for petty disputes. He had clear, discerning eyes that seemed to take in the entire room with a single, sweeping glance. Mr. Sterling began immediately, his voice smooth and persuasive. He launched into their case, meticulously detailing Richard's final years, spinning a narrative where I, Eleanor, had isolated Richard from his children and manipulated him into signing a restrictive will when his health was first failing. He used flowery language about protecting the legacy of the Vance name and ensuring Richard's estate was distributed among the deserving progeny. I felt the blood rising in my face at the audacity of the lies. Sarah gently placed a hand on my arm, a silent command for restraint. Sterling concluded his opening argument by stating, "The fact remains, Your Honor, that these children, William and Jessica, stand ready to honor their father's memory. They simply seek a fair accounting of the assets and protection against an alleged breach of fiduciary duty by the defendant." Judge Harrison, who had been listening silently, steepled his fingers on the bench. He looked from Sterling to William, then to Jessica, and finally his gaze settled on me. The atmosphere was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and years of hidden resentments. The moment was upon us. Sarah stood up, ready to begin the defense, ready to introduce the years of hospital logs. But before she could speak, the judge looked down at the documents laid out before him. The will, the contestations, the medical records, and then back at my children. He didn't look at the paper. He looked directly at William and Jessica, and his first question wasn't about the law, but about their hearts. Judge Harrison didn't wait for Sarah's opening statement. He skipped the formalities entirely, a clear sign of his immediate dissatisfaction with the case's moral foundation. He simply picked up Richard's last will and testament and read the key paragraph aloud, his voice clear and resonant. "I hereby leave all my estate, both real and personal, to my beloved wife, Eleanor Vance, for her sole and unconditional use, management, and inheritance." He put the document down. "Mr. Sterling, the will is legally sound. The date predates any severe medical incapacitation. Your entire case rests on an extremely difficult argument of undue influence that has no physical evidence and relies purely on inference. I am struggling to find merit here." This was Sarah's cue. She rose, presenting the envelope with careful gravity. "Your Honor, while the will is indeed clear, we understand the claimant's position regarding the spirit of their father's intentions. To address this, we request that the court review this codicil, a document written by Richard Vance 6 months prior to his illness. It is not a legally binding will in the strictest sense, but it is a written declaration of his deepest concerns regarding his estate and his children." There was an audible intake of breath from William and Jessica. The arrogance in their posture finally fractured. They hadn't known about the envelope. It was Richard's secret voice, finally speaking. Judge Harrison took the envelope, examined the red seal with interest, and then, using a letter opener provided by the bailiff, he broke the wax and unfolded the pages. The courtroom was silent. Every eye was fixed on the judge. He read slowly, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to profound, focused attention. The document wasn't a legal instrument. It was a heartfelt, almost heartbreaking letter from Richard to the world, a man preparing for the worst. It detailed his love for me, Eleanor, but it went further. It specifically addressed his children. The judge began reading a specific section aloud, his voice taking on a tone of moral weight. And to my children, William and Jessica, I leave a legacy that is conditional on their character. Should I become incapacitated and unable to communicate, I formally and ethically request that they maintain regular, consistent, and genuinely caring contact with me and support their mother, Eleanor, who will bear the burden of my care. This is their final test. If upon my death it is found that they abandoned me and left my wife alone, then I endorse and support her sole inheritance completely, confirming that it is my explicit wish that their portion of the estate be reduced to zero, reflecting the emptiness of their efforts. The judge lowered the letter, his face pale with shock and a simmering anger. He looked over the document again, then over the medical and visitor log Sarah had attached as proof. He looked at William, his immaculate suit now seeming suffocating. He looked at Jessica, whose carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the sudden terror in her eyes. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. But the question that came next was delivered with a quiet, icy disdain that froze the entire room. It was the question I had waited 5 years to hear. Mr. Vance, Ms. Vance, Judge Harrison said, his voice deadly calm, the records here indicate, conclusively, that over the last 60 months, between the two of you, there were a total of 7 visits, none lasting more than 20 minutes. The man who wrote this letter was your father. You didn't even visit your own father once all these years, and you are here now, trying to humiliate your mother and contest the very last wish of the man who foresaw your betrayal? What is your defense? The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the crushing, absolute weight of their shame. The air in the courtroom became instantly toxic, thick with the smell of shame and defeat. William and Jessica didn't move. They just stared at the judge, paralyzed. Mr. Sterling, their high-priced lawyer, finally jumped to his feet, stammering, "Your Honor, that is not a legal question. The moral intent of a letter cannot supersede the law of wills." "Sit down, counsel," Judge Harrison commanded, his voice gaining a hard, sharp edge. "This court is an instrument of justice, not just law." Mr. Vance specifically conditioned the spirit of his legacy, and the evidence shows his children failed that condition spectacularly. "I have seen the visitor logs. I have seen the expenses. I have heard the defendant's testimony. This document confirms the testator's desire to protect his wife from the very kind of opportunistic attack we are witnessing today." The judge didn't look at Mr. Sterling. His eyes were fixed entirely on William and Jessica. Jessica's facade finally shattered. Her eyes welled up, not with sorrow for her father, but with raw impotence and fury at being exposed. She brought a trembling hand up to her mouth, stifling a small, desperate sob. William, the slick financier, suddenly looked like a frightened little boy. His tailored suit seemed to sag around his shoulders. They realized in that agonizing moment that not only had they lost the money, but they had been publicly exposed by their father's final silent judgment. Judge Harrison didn't drag it out. He didn't need to. The moral victory was already absolute. "This court finds in favor of the defendant, Eleanor Vance," he announced, slamming his gavel down, a final decisive punctuation mark. "The last will and testament of Richard Vance stands, and Ms. Vance is confirmed as the sole and unconditional inheritor of the entire estate. Case dismissed." The sound of the gavel was deafening. It was the sound of a cycle closing. Mr. Sterling started murmuring something about an appeal, but the judge simply shook his head, his look saying everything. "I didn't cheer. I didn't even smile. I just sat there, allowing the exhaustion of 5 years of caregiving, plus the months of legal harassment, to settle into my bones." Sarah leaned over, her eyes shining with pride. "We did it, Eleanor." Richard spoke, and Justice listened. "I finally looked at my children." William was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched, defeated. Jessica was openly weeping, but her tears felt cheap, a performance for an audience of 2, the court stenographer and me. There was no remorse in them, only the bitter resentment of those who had been caught trying to commit a cruel act. I stood up slowly, deliberately. I put my handbag over my shoulder and nodded once to Sarah. It was over. I had protected Richard's legacy, defended my home, and most importantly, I had forced them to face the consequences of their abandonment. The truth was out, not just for the family, but for the public record. I took one last look at the two defeated figures at the plaintiff's table, and the pity I thought I might feel simply wasn't there. There was a cold, hard clarity instead. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. I was free, but the biggest decision of my life, what to do with that freedom, was waiting for me on the other side. When I pushed through those massive courthouse doors and stepped out onto the granite steps, the sun felt unexpectedly warm on my face. It was the first time in what felt like a lifetime that I had taken a breath that wasn't laden with fear, grief, or courtroom anxiety. I inhaled deeply, feeling the clean, crisp autumn air fill my lungs, and for the first time, I was truly relieved. The battle was won. Richard's last wish, the wish to protect me and condemn the children's lack of care, had been honored. The house was mine, the assets were mine, and the record showed clearly that William and Jessica had abandoned their father in his hour of greatest need. They had been exposed, not by a news headline, but by a judge's final, devastating question. Sarah, my marvelous lawyer, caught up to me. Eleanor, that was incredible. That letter changed everything. Now, let's talk about closing the estate. The house is yours, free and clear. I looked at her, at the kind, professional woman who had fought for me, and I smiled, a genuine, tired smile. Thank you, Sarah. You were amazing. Then I told her my final decision. The one I had been agonizing over for weeks. The one that would truly close the cycle. I want you to prepare the papers to list the house for sale immediately, I told her. Sarah blinked. The house? Eleanor, you just fought tooth and nail to keep it. I fought to keep it from them, Sarah. Not to keep it for me, I explained, my voice gentle but firm. That house is a beautiful prison. It's filled with Richard's memory, which I cherish, but it's also filled with the ghosts of 5 years of solitude and the ghosts of 2 children who only saw its value in dollars. If I stay there, every corner will remind me of the man who died alone and the children who let him. That house is the symbol of the conflict. I need a fresh start. A different coast, a different view, a different life. Sarah understood immediately. She didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes acknowledging the profound sense of personal freedom in my choice. As for William and Jessica, they called me later that week. Not to apologize, but to make one final, pathetic attempt at salvaging something. William, stiff and formal, suggested that since I was an older woman who surely couldn't manage the complexity of Richard's estate alone, they should be appointed as financial advisors. Jessica, through teary drama, claimed she had always loved me and that we should rebuild our relationship. I listened to them both, and then I delivered my final words to my children, my final confession, if you will. You didn't want your father when he was a person. You only wanted him when he was property, I told William, my voice flat, devoid of anger or affection. You will not touch his estate, and you will not touch my life. You have made your choice, and now you must live with the consequences. I hung up the phone. I changed my number. I sold the house 3 months later for a generous price, taking only the cedar box and a few precious photographs. I didn't send William or Jessica a dime, not even a forwarding address. I used the money to buy a small, charming condo overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a place where the sounds are the waves and the birds, not beeping monitors or judgmental silence. My children tried to humiliate me and seize my home. The judge simply exposed their truth, and justice prevailed. But the true, final victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the choice I made afterward. I didn't hold on to the past or the painful monument of my marriage. I honored Richard's love by finally taking the freedom he had secured for me. The cycle of mother, wife, and caregiver is closed. I am simply Eleanor, and the life I saved is my own. And that, I realized, was the richest inheritance of all.